Hello, folks. Today, I myself, Greg Moffitt, legalizefreedom.com, joined by Jasun Horsley, and we're doing an informal follow-up to a recent talk that we had, um, harvesting humans and the rise of machine intelligence. That was a talk, for legalized freedom. Today, it's a little bit more off the cuff. And you'll find information about, there's some show notes accompanying this video, which will help you navigate. It may be a good idea to back to that talk and listen to that before you get into this one. But we don't necessarily, I certainly don't have a roadmap for the talk today. Entities, I guess, is the, and what we're really dealing with is the headline. That's how we kind of advertised this today. So yeah, we're just going to start, and then at some point we'll end. And I think, Jason, did you say we'd be able to take questions as we go from anybody who happens to be sitting in on this?
Yeah, I gave that option if people want to put things in the chat.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, this is kind of a continuation, because when we did our last talk, I think we drew to a conclusion in terms of temporally, if not, in terms of subject matter. And I really felt that I wanted to go a little bit deeper, and the talk that the areas that we were getting into reflect something that a dimension of our experience on the earth that I've been increasingly interested in exploring with many different authors, researchers over the last few years. I do remember a turning point very clearly. It was during the COVID era, so it would be like 2 or 3 years ago, and I was listening to a talk. I can't remember which talk it was. Maybe you remember, Jason, but it was one that you did on the liminalist talk, and out of that grew a talk that we did, which people can find at legalizefreedom.com, which I entitled "What If Some People Out There in the World Are Not Like Us?" And I think that may have been literally a quote from yourself in the aforementioned liminalist talk. And that's led me down. I read about egregores before, read about tulpas. All my life I had a sense that there was other dimensions to reality, the beyond the 5 sense and the 3-dimensional. But I had a sense that there was some kind of force or forces, or the phrase I used earlier, entities. There's something out there that's influencing us for good or ill. And it was as a result of your talk, that, the liminalist one that I referred to, that this idea crystallized in my mind that at this time, one of the reasons that so many of us, if not all of us, are struggling to comprehend what's going on this planet is because our, generally speaking, hardcore materialist cosmology worldview is preventing us from thinking or believing or imagining that there can be anything beyond 5 senses and 3 dimensions. But if we let go of that, then suddenly we can begin to, it makes room for possibilities, if not understanding of what might be going on, quote unquote, behind the scenes. So that was more of a series of statements rather than a question, Jason.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just checking that it wasn't a delay or something. That it was
No.
a natural pause. Yeah, so I remember the podcast, and I remember because it was just me on my own, and it was a follow-up to a much older podcast from my AOLSK for Stormy Weather Days called The Sorcerer's Revelation. When I presented, I flew this idea that what if some people are not people? And I was suggesting that there might be thought forms out there that assumed human form or passed for people. I was exploring the idea anyway, and I revisited it. I can't remember why I revisited it for that podcast, because it wasn't directly connected to the entity exploration that I've been involved in the last couple of years. Although it was connected to something that Dave Ashana said, I vaguely remember that, because it caused me to go back to that material. So yeah, and currently, as you know, Greg, I have been trying to practically explore this question of entities, like find a way to practically address it, not just talk about it or think about it, and not just understand it, because it might not be possible to understand it without, like, farming. You can read all the books you want to about farming, and you talk about the theory of farming, but farming isn't really theoretical, it's practical. And I'd say that's really true of anything that has any real meaning. It's got to have a practical application, but some things we can't understand except by practicing them, like farming. So then and philosophy is kind of the opposite of that. It's so abstract, whereas entities, I'd say, they have to be practical, and once upon a time they were practical. One of the things Dave O'Shan has been saying recently that I found interesting in this regard is that the New Testament in the Bible is very much about dealing with spirits and dealing with entities. It's not a manual, but that's a real, more than a subtext of the gospel and the New Testament. It's just a thread that runs through it, and the Old Testament. Angels, fallen and unfallen, and demons, and whatever else is in there. So it is, as you were saying, it is something that until quite recently it was part of the Weltanschauung, the way, and there was a practical understanding of it to some degree. So that's where I'm at anyway. Like, the reason I'm talking about it with you and with other people is to try and use language as a way to, and thinking and understanding as a way to feel our way back into a felt sense of it. And when you said, what was the last thing you said? Behind the scenes, as it were. That probably the meaning that many people would go to, at least in our typical audience, if there is such a thing, but people who listen to you or I, would be behind the scenes of world politics, or behind the scenes in sense of invisible string, puppet masters and stuff, human or otherwise. But where I went with that, when you said it, was into the blood, inside of us. Like that's kind of inside the scenes. But how are we being controlled? Is it externally, or is it internally, or is it both? I'd say it's both. But one of the ways I feel that we can talk about and start to explore entities is by referring internally, because by definition, I think we'd agree they're invisible, and in our five senses, our normal senses don't perceive them because we haven't opened our spiritual senses. But that's the problem. So where does it start? I mean, we're not just going to start squinting at the shadows. I suppose some people might. I would say it starts with trying to get a sense of the entities that are most closely involved with us, and they would be at least partly on the inside.
The idea of control from the inside is very interesting. And by the way, when or if anyone else, Jason and I or anyone else refers to, the COVID period, the pandemic, generally it doesn't matter what you think about what that was or wasn't, so don't necessarily read anything in particular or overlay your own agenda or thoughts onto anything that's said by anyone else. But the bodily integrity idea was really key there, wasn't it? Because I've often thought, there's this idea that one's mind is kind of the last bastion, isn't it? Whatever they can do to you, you can be put in prison. The gulag. This comes out from Nazi prisoner of war survivors, and other similar scenarios that in their own minds that was one territory that their persecutors, the prison guards couldn't get into. So what you said about this idea of being controlled from within is kind of really interesting and kind of alarming in a way, because we like to think that our bodies are our own. It's one thing that we can control. Most of us don't. We abuse our bodies, what we put into them, and also our minds, of course. But again, it was the COVID thing. I think was such a learning process for so many people in so many ways, and it had the opposite effect. It sent many people deeper into unconsciousness. But the idea, bodily integrity and in terms of entities, in terms of control and manipulation, is really, really interesting. And overlay that with some of the ideas, some of the more esoteric ideas that some people have put forth about the COVID era, about vaccines, for example, and what that was about, and then start, I'm thinking one of the things that I discovered during the COVID period, I knew who Rudolf Steiner was, but I'd never really approached his work. And when I read his, there's a book that was published, I mean, I can see it from here, I just can't get to it. There was a book that was published during the COVID period, which brought together everything that he wrote and said about vaccines. And it's a real jaw dropper, if anyone hasn't read it, just to go, oh my God, he said this, not to attribute these insights uniquely to him, but nevertheless, he's a prominent occultist who came out with this stuff.
Yeah, I haven't read that. I mean, I've listened to audios about it. What was I thinking before you brought up Steiner? It was about this control. That seemed to be the larger question. Because the vaccine, whatever, the mRNA and so on, these are literalizations of invading the body. And maybe they're making it concrete. And this is, as I suppose everybody knows in the Bible, the mark of the beast. It seems like there is this association with the end times, or with a critical period in human evolution or spiritual destiny, where the imposition of demonic control becomes concrete and physical. And it does seem as though we're seeing that, but it is by something that's been going on for a very long time, that took this long, like a cancer, to metastasize. And the thing about being controlled, like we've been being controlled. Oh, this is what Big Mother is about in the book that I've written that's coming out later this year, that all of the technology that's being created to control us, what's going on there? Human beings are creating technology to control other human beings. Well, I suppose you can square that circle if you have this idea of this separate elite faction of human beings behind the scenes cackling and rubbing their hands, but that has never really satisfied me, because to really work, it'd have to be a different species in some way. It'd have to establish such a degree of separation to maintain control that it would be like two species. So I find it much more satisfying, and it ticks more of the boxes if we're talking about some unseen or unknown anti-human or non-human presence, even though that is a tricky area, as we've seen with David Icke or Whitley Strieber or these other characters. But yeah, the point that I explore with Big Mother is it seems to be that invisible entities are manipulating human beings to create the technology whereby human beings can be manipulated. So again, what I was trying to get to is we're already being manipulated at a very deep level before we create the technology that seems to be finalizing the control system, like a trap that's getting sprung. So then this question again, how have we been invaded internally? How are we being controlled internally? And why is it that we don't know it? Because that's the point you started with, Greg, is that it's a scary idea, and we like to think that we have control over our minds. But don't you think it's weird? Because I think everybody knows, not just a discerning, self-examining person such as you or I, everybody pretty much knows that they can't control their thoughts and their feelings, because their whole life is a testimony to that struggle. Like they're unhappy, they're confused, etc. And all someone has to do is try and stop their thinking to find out they can't do it. Everybody knows what it's like to have thoughts they don't want to have, to get pulled this way and that by thought, right? It's just so typical, right, of our existence. So it's like this thing that's hiding in plain sight. We know we know we don't have control internally, but we never attribute it to, well, some of us do, but a lot of people don't attribute it to anything else. They just accept it. It's just kind of normal. It's normal that you've got no control over your thoughts and your feelings, and you feel like you're constantly being pulled this way and that, and doing things you wish you wouldn't do, and not able to do things that you wish you could do. It's right. It's just the human conditioning, quotes, or human nature even.
Yeah, what happens to the idea of the decisions being your own and free will in all of that?
Yeah.
In terms of technology, um, there's a book that I read again during the COVID period that I was drawn to by a Steiner scholar called Paul Emberson. He's no longer with us, but his book, excuse me, Machines and the Human Spirit, and he sums up Steiner's view. And again, I'm only just using Steiner as a sort of a benchmark. I mean, these ideas are not new, of different types of technology. And what Steiner refers to as atomic technology, which I think is, we could characterize as the technology that we develop against our best interests. The scientific and industrial stuff that gets done that appears to be, or is like destroying us. And I'm no eco-activist as such, you know, it's not that, but we do these things, like for example, in CERN at one point, I can't remember when it was, a few years ago, and I don't know what exactly they were doing, but I remember the news headlines at the time. Oh, if we activate this device, it may, you know, implode the universe. Okay, right. Maybe you don't want to do that, but they're going to do it anyway. And there's a episode of the British science fiction series Doctor Who, where one of his arch nemesis, Davros, at one point the Doctor and he are in dialogue, and the Doctor says to Davros, Davos, sorry, no, Davros.
I remember Davros.
Yeah. So if you had a vial of some kind of germ or virus, little glass vial between your thumb and forefinger, and if you knew if you broke that, it would extinguish all life in the universe, or it might do, would you do it? Again, I'm just paraphrasing the dialogue now, and Davros says, what a fascinating idea. Yes, I would do it. You know? So there's something, again, influencing us without doubt, against our own interests, and causing this technology to be developed. And we see this today in the transhumanist and the in AI and whatnot. And the people developing this are saying they have grave concerns about what they're doing, but they feel compelled to usher in this new technology, whatever the consequences happen to be. They feel compelled, and some of them will even say, "Oh, I think there's actually a more than 50% chance that this will wipe out humanity as we know it." But off I go to work.
Right. Yeah, I just saw that. Maybe this is a bit of a digression, but I just noticed on somebody tweeted that Zuckerberg has cancelled his plans for a metaverse. Did you hear that?
No, that's news to me. But I mean, even from a financial point of view, the whole meta thing's just been a disaster. If you're an investor, you'd have your head in your hands.
Yeah.
So no, that's absolutely news to me.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's true or not, but it reminds me now of what it's one of the things I explored in Prisoner Infinity, about the space, the idea of colonizing space, and the generation of ideas around space and space travel to make it compatible with a secular religion, or turn it into components of a secular religion, in order to really animate those ideas and give them the kind of meaning that would motivate people to try and realize them. So, I mean, obvious example would be people who grew up on Star Trek. They might not become Trekkies, but even if they didn't, they were in love with the show, and so they grew up with this quasi-spiritual fascination with the show and with the whole idea of space travel, and they grew up to become, designers and so on, and space engineers and IT workers and whatever else, whoever designed those cell phones, that resemble in Star Trek, etc., etc. And all of this potentially is meant cynically just to keep the wheels of I could say capitalist, but I think that's a Marxist term, but you know, a control system that depends on production and factory lines and enslaving people and so on. The system as we know it, as it's evolved, even with IT and all the rest of it, to just keep that going and to keep people motivated. And it doesn't really matter if space travel is even possible. Never mind if it has anything to do with human evolution or spiritual aspirations, all that stuff that's added on top of it. I'd say, I mean, based on what I explored there in Prison Infinity, it doesn't even really matter if space travel is possible, as long as people believe it's possible and you can create the industry and the aspiration. It would mean that if it wasn't possible, then NASA would have to be a big cover-up and all that money was going into sex trafficking or something else, right? Which it could be. Well, sex trafficking makes money, but it takes money too, or whatever else. But anyway, I was just thinking of all that with the metaverse. Does it even matter if the metaverse is really possible as it's foreseen, or is it more of a shoehorn for something else that just keeps people believing in the technology, that somehow it's going to keep morphing, it's going to keep creating new opportunities, new solutions? Because that's it, isn't it? It's like, reminds me of the aliens as well. Like the aliens are always being promised to come, or the gods, if you're into the von Daniken stuff, the ancient astronauts, same thing really. They're always promising to come, but they never come, because if they came, it would be really dreary. Like as soon as they entered into our reality, unless they destroyed us completely, then they'd become reduced to just one more element of our reality. Whereas the whole point is that the solution has to be magical. That's something Steiner writes about as well, talked about as Iron Man, that he would present some magical solution. So that, I think that's this undying aspiration, is that human beings get possessed by the idea that somehow they can be instrumental in bringing about a magical solution that will solve all problems. And so it's dissociative, to really crunch it down to something simple. Like it depends on being dissociated and disconnected from reality, and it intensifies and aggravates the disconnection. And we're seeing literally with the solutions now are less about space travel and more about the metaverse and the cloud and transhumanism, uploading consciousness, etc. I'm trying to think of more, whatever's current really. There's a lot of variations, aren't there? But they do seem to be consistently to do with the reification of mentalized or imagery, and the rejection of and the debasement of just physical reality. So then that last thing you said, or at least the thing I'm remembering now that you said, they don't care. It might destroy humanity, but they'll do it anyway. Well, transhumanism, actually, I think it requires the destruction of humanity in a certain sense, because if you get to the point, if you take transgender, let's say, the desire to be in a different body, all the way to, or I should say, if you take body dysphoria, the unhappiness with one's body, one's physical existence, all the way past all the last variation, then you end up with, I don't want a body at all. And that's transhumanism. Essentially, you can just become information. And that is destruction of humanity. If you're going to turn humanity into pure information, then you've just destroyed humanity. So maybe that this could be an example of an entity controlling a human, that the human doesn't realize. He thinks that they're different, as in saving humanity and destroying humanity. But to the entity, they're not. They're this, well, the entity doesn't care about saving humanity. That's right. It's not it's just, it has a different agenda, and the agenda is just, I don't know about destroy humanity exactly, but enslave humanity completely under the guise of saving humanity. I mean, it's such a cliche, isn't it? We're talking about like the plots of bad sci-fi movies for 70 years, but we're in it.
Yeah, I think even just from, I've read a lot of sci-fi in my life, and written and spoken about it a lot. And in all of that, there's something people have talked about bringing things into being. Sort of like a spell. First you write it down, the sci-fi dystopia, and then it starts to become into being. But I think in all of that, there's more kind of been a knowing, and a lot of culture does this. I think it's our us putting out ideas, thoughts, putting them out in a way that is apparently safe, um, because it's supposedly fiction. But I think within it is embedded a kind of a knowing about a direction of travel, and I think that's interesting in itself because um, as much as you have futurists and technologists um, trying to shape and design the future, I think in many ways within us there's a lot of kind of we how can I put this? It sounds like knowing where the direction that we're headed in, but without really consciously acknowledging it. If you see what I mean, and that's what leads to a lot of our discombobulation at this particular time in our development. I think there's a lot of things I think that we're unconsciously aware of that we don't wish to acknowledge about our direction of travel.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, and you can't completely suppress these things, so they have to come up. They might come up in dreams. We can forget your dreams, and then, or they might come up through the culture in these distorted forms, as movies and books and plays and stuff. Uh, and I mean, that split between the conscious mind and the unconscious, the dissociated thing where we can be unaware that we're destroying ourselves or we're complicit with something that's destroying us. That's also, that sounds like possession, as in there's something in us that's driving us and we think it's us because it's hidden its presence, but we don't understand. And even we're not conscious, we don't understand why we're doing certain things, and even to some extent the worst things we're doing, we're either unconscious of doing them, or we've somehow made ourselves unconscious that they're what the consequences are, so we can get away with it, we can keep on doing them.
in occult terms, I've been reading recently and applying it to my own life. The sort of the concepts of the balance between and the interplay between karma and destiny on both hands, and will in between that, and how will can affect the balance between these things. The idea of karma being, if you think of just in former lives or whatever, but we're very much thinking about this maybe on a collective species level, something that we're unconsciously carrying, that for good or ill, usually ill, that doesn't serve us, but that we're acting out, usually unconsciously, that we're not aware of. You'll see this in your own, not necessarily you, Jason, but anyone listening to this now, you'll see this in your own life by things that you do, things that you say, whatever it happens to be, that you don't recognize as yourself. That's not me. Why did I do that? Just think of it as like, in whatever metaphorical terms, waking up with a hangover. Why did I get drunk last night? That wasn't me, or I don't like to think of myself in that way. Well, then what is that? It could be, that's what karma kind of is in a way. Something that's being held over from the past, whatever, collectively or individually, or both. Destiny being that kind of higher thing, the thing that you aspire to, the way you like to think of yourself, the thing, where you think you're headed, again, or where we think we're headed as a species, and then will being how much you can exercise that. And this is, I think, what we're really struggling with, where we find ourselves now. How much you can drive towards, destiny, and leave aside karma, that which has been processed, or whatever it happens to be. So, yeah, that's something I've been reflecting on. It's been very useful for me, that kind of those kind of metaphors, thinking about, in terms of, the human condition, again, individually and collectively. But it's something I've been thinking about in terms of the course of my own life recently, and thinking recently about my entire life, and it's been very useful for me. It's had some good insights, actually, to say, okay, yeah, so that stuff that I did or whatever that I didn't think of as me, if I can think of that in terms of karma, then maybe if that's something from a former life or whatever, then I don't know. It's been very, very useful, to see events and decisions through that lens.
I'm wondering if it, because what I mean, one could, I might want to transpose karma, because that's an Eastern term, with ancestry. That would be pretty similar and pretty close, wouldn't it? Like ancestral patterns that we've inherited.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And they capture us to some degree. Well, I'm having two thoughts simultaneously, so I might end up losing both of them. So one of them is that this destiny thing, like the things that I aspire to, how do I separate those from the ancestral patterns or the entities? Because we're incepted with ideas and aspirations, right? By the culture and by our ancestry, by the unlived life of our parents and all of that. So that's tricky. That's one thing. And another thing, I don't know whether it's connected, but I'm kind of involved in this right now, even though I partly wish I wasn't, which is that I've very recently, I've got re-obsessed or re-ignited by my passion for movies, for cinema. And I've been looking at old scripts I've written, and I've been thinking, God, I would actually really like to make this movie. And this is something, you know, I just wrote 16 Mounts of Hell. Like, I thought that I had pretty much moved away from all of this and towards the simple life as a farmer. But I find now that it actually still has some hold over me. And so is this karma, or is this destiny? Is this something, and is it perhaps my destiny, or is it essential to my destiny to get free of my karma that I have to re-engage with something that has obsessed me in a way that neutralizes it? Because if just sheer willpower isn't enough, that's the third thing, like will, well, where does that come from? So anyway, I mean, those are my thoughts there. That it's I suppose the unifying point there is entities again. Like how do we know when it's not an entity? Like, even the desire to get free of entities could be an entity. Even the desire to get free of karma, or as I said about destiny, that could be something that we inherited. So it seems as though I suppose it's the point I led with, isn't it? It has to be experiential. What's our felt experience sense of coming clean? Because to me, that's what it's all about. Which I feel I'm trying. When you talk about destiny, what I really aspire to, I don't really aspire to make a movie. I mean, if I could only say one thing, it wouldn't be that. It wouldn't be anything worldly. I'd say I'm aspiring to save my soul. But that's something. I mean, how do you approach saving your soul? We don't have a point of reference. I feel like, I mean, we've got the Bible, so that's not nothing. But it's certainly at a very practical level, in terms of resolving the things, or identifying, getting clear of entities that have possessed me. It's not clear. It's not clear to me how to proceed. I thought it was. Recently, I mean, until recently, maybe I hoped it was, but then I discovered over time that it's just not really practical. As in, I thought, well, if I just give up everything and just go back to working the land, then it'll take care of itself after that. And that may still be the case, but it's a lot harder than I thought it was, in more ways than one. Like, just going back to the land is physically, practically hard, but also taking out those cultural, ancestral, or karmic implants that drive me to try and fulfill a destiny that perhaps isn't a true destiny, isn't compatible with a true destiny. That's a lot harder.
What if there? I wonder which would be worse, actually. This idea, this very broad concept that we're imagining, entity possession. What is it we're dealing with? Forces behind the scenes, all of that. What if there was actually none of that, and it was all just us?
Well, I used to believe that. I mean, because I went. Well, Prisoner of Infinity was a sort of grounding point for me, because I'd spent so many years believing in sorcery and occultism and all that stuff, and I felt it was the second matrix that I felt in certain ways more trapped in than I had been in the first matrix, because it was bigger and it was closer to reality, so it was harder to it's easy enough to reject the first matrix for me in terms of, you know, go to college, get a job, the social conventions are obviously always false to me, but the second matrix is occultism and entities and all that. So with the process of Prison Infinity, it was very much about, can this all be stripped down just to us? Could this all just be us? And that the psyche is so mysterious that it can fragment into autonomous fragments, and then they come to us as if they're right angels and demons and so on. So I've definitely been there, but now I'm back to entities. It's like that saying about first mountains are mountains, and then they're not mountains, and then they're mountains again. So first entities are entities, then they're not entities, they're just us, and then they're entities again. That's where I'm at now. It could be that they're going to be not entities again. I don't know.
I remember just speaking about you know, entities, this idea there being something else going on. Again, not a new idea to me at all. And by the way, when I've used the word occult here, I'm simply talking about, you know, hidden, you know, esoteric, that's which beyond our immediate perception, etc. Not necessarily talking about any particular belief system or anything like that, or any practice. During the COVID period, what brought me back to the idea that, you know, there's and more powerfully than ever, I think, in my life, there's something else at play here. And this isn't just human beings doing these things to each other, was the cruelty to children. I'm not a parent, but, you know, I've got friends and relatives who have children of various ages. So sort of in a third-hand way, I've kind of, you know, experienced the upbringing of children. But that was one of the most disturbing things, if not the most disturbing thing during the pandemic period, was the way that children were allowed to suffer. And I just thought the people, the entities, the forces, whatever that could allow this to happen, never mind cause it to happen, cannot be human. It just cannot be surely human. And we've seen this throughout human history as well, haven't we? Like I mentioned, the Nazi death camps. Things have happened throughout human history. You think, can that really be one species doing that to itself? You know, people doing that to other people like them, or are they not like them? So that was the most recent, let's say, time when I was brought back to all this. And again, that was around about the time that I listened to your podcast, and it really got me thinking. And that train of thought is very much alive at the minute. In fact, it's informed a lot of the ideas that I've explored since then, you know, not least with yourself.
I think there's a growing idea, I think, in secular society, it's consistent with woke culture, I think, that human beings are bad, that the human nature is more than just flawed. And that would be a way to reconcile that tension that for you led you to want to explore the possibility of demonic entities or something non-human and anti-human involved. And of course I concur, because I think I've always known that human beings, the human nature, just like nature itself, is fundamentally good, that it comes out of something that is profoundly good, and that it is consistent with, it is an instrument of goodness, and therefore it leads to goodness. But clearly human society is not that way. So I was a misanthropist from quite a young age, long before it became fashionable. I guess part of being a progressive, you know, a child of progressive parents. And now it is fashionable, I think. And I'd say that is evidence of a demonic influence at work that is making human beings less and less human, and therefore kind of establishing an attitude or a belief that human beings are just bad, and that because the whole environmental movement, Extinction Rebellion, took it to a weird extreme. It was weirdly contradictory, because it seemed as though Extinction Rebellion, which is, for those who haven't researched it, Luke Dodson did enough research to convince me, I didn't need convincing really, that it was a socially engineered movement. It wasn't a grassroots thing, but a top-down thing. But then they seem to be pushing for the destruction of human beings, essentially, to avoid an extinction event, which is back to this paradox again. We have to destroy humanity to save humanity, or more literally, perhaps, or more specifically with the Extinction Rebellion, to save Mother Nature, the planet. Humans have to go because they're a cancer on the face of the planet. That idea has been around at least since the 70s. And recently I had this insight, if it is an insight, about Lucifer, like the myth of Lucifer, about how he was the brightest angel of God, and then God created humanity, and then God put his attention on humanity and said, this is man, he's made in my image. And in the Quran, even, I think it's in the Quran, or at least it's in Islam, I think, that Lucifer and the angels were supposed to bow down to man. And Lucifer said no, and basically he was jealous, and then God cast him down. Well, but not before he didn't just say no. The serpent actually went in there into Eve and got in her blood and screwed up the whole project. And then he got cast down, and so what occurred to me was that if Lucifer in this mythic fable was jealous of humanity, and he himself got cast down, that what Lucifer's end game, really, and maybe it was there at the beginning, was, I'll make humanity, the God is raised up, I'm going to drag them down to the lowest possible level, even now to my own level, because I've been cast down, and then God will reject them. And then Lucifer will have his revenge, because God rejected Lucifer. And it's like in Job, that's the bet that Lucifer makes with Job. He says, give me your best man and I'll turn him against you. And God says, okay, down there, it's Job, do your best. Not very considerate of God to let Job, his best man. But anyway, it's, God works in mysterious ways. But that is it. And it's a very tidy nutshell that Satan's MO, and that somehow God goes along with it. Okay, it's in the Quran. Where was I trying to end up on here? Human beings' debasement. Oh yeah, so that the more that human beings are possessed by Ahrimanic or Luciferic entities, or whatever it is, the less human they become, the more they both reject their own human nature and in human beings, but they also embody an anti-human principle, so they become less than human, and so they become their own proof. So ironic. They're like the anti-humans become proof of the evil, or the unworthiness of human beings. And so I don't want to say even you or I, but even those humans who are most aligned with goodness, or trying to be, we end up with kind of the inescapability of considering that most human beings, perhaps a majority that seems to be, the mass momentum, the mass that is creating the momentum of human self-destruction, are not human. They appear not to be human at some level. I mean, this is where it gets tricky, because as you probably remember, Greg, I worked in the thrift store, so I was dealing with hundreds of human individuals a week, and in a weird way, it confirmed this idea, but it also contradicted it, because I was constantly dealing with human beings who in many ways seemed less than human, but they also did seem human to me, and I was always mostly able to have a compassionate response. So I think it's a really difficult thing to talk about or to understand. There's an anti-life force that's taking over the human species, kind of one body at a time, and it's probably unlikely that you or I are going to meet somebody who is completely taken over, because they're probably at a very high level of society. And what we're more likely to encounter, or I did in a thrift store, are the casualties, the broken eggs in this satanic omelette, who are they are subhuman, I'd say. Like an addict becomes subhuman because they're just driven by appetites, but they're not malevolent. They're kind of unconscious instruments, so they're closer to. I suppose a hungry ghost would be an analogy. Like a hungry ghost isn't really evil or malevolent. It's just this vampiric appetite that can't make choices because all it can do is feed. So that's a junkie. A junkie doesn't really, I mean, it's more obvious compared to other humans who aren't junkies that person isn't making, it doesn't have free will. They can't make choices because they're just so driven to get the heroin that everything they do is about getting the heroin. And then when they get the heroin, of course they don't have free will because they're just going to shoot up, and then they're just totally spaced out in another world. So that's a very stark example, and it's not, it's very close to home to me. So I'm not talking in the abstract. My brother was a heroin addict, and my brother-in-law died. They both died of heroin overdoses. So it's very tragic, and it isn't just the walking wounded of the lower class. It spans the whole spectrum of society. But I brought it as an example of something that is kind of subhuman, or reaches a subhuman level of functioning that we can still have compassion for. But we have to recognize that, something is taken over human beings collectively and individual that seems to only have a will to death. It's like a death drive.
Yeah, the science fiction metaphor for all that is like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, isn't it? That sort of there's entities, or there's a force, a non-human force that's taking over the species, but for whatever reason, a handful of humans in that case remain immune, or they could see, or like John Carpenter's film They Live. Again, there's the same three-pronged kind of situation unfolding. And I suppose it's like also, in Dracula, for example, there's a few, well, just the idea, there's only a handful of vampires, but there's a lot of Renfields, in service to their master, but they weren't once like that. And the possibility maybe still exists for them to be, to be redeemed if their master is slain. Certainly there's the idea in a recent series of interviews I did, Grey Aliens and Artificial Intelligence. There was Nigel Kerner was the author of that book. He did 3 books on that topic. He, again, no longer with us. Why do these people keep dying? One thing that seems to contribute to someone's chance of dying is for me to contact them about an interview. But anyway,
keep that on the down low, I think.
But the idea there again is there's some force or some entities, whatever it happens to be, non-human, that in some ways, just the simplest word is that they envy us, or that we have something that they can never have. And they're trying to either emulate that, or to steal it, or to destroy it. If we can't have it, then nobody can, sort of idea. And you used the word debasement a few minutes ago. Yeah, humans being, that idea of us being, has to be shown that we are worthless, and that we are dirt, and that we are a cancer on the planet. You very much see that in the culture now, don't you? That's what it seems to be about. The most prominent manifestation of this at the minute for me is the whole trans thing. And again, I've I've done interviews around this and spoken to people who have transitioned from one gender to another. And it's got nothing, no reflection really on what anybody's identity or how they see themselves, what they want to be, what they want to become. If that's something different, to their previous incarnation or whatever that happens to be, no judgment there whatsoever. I'm talking about and I've started to write transhumanism now with trans in brackets. So it's transhumanism because trans is just, being applied to more and more aspects and dimensions of our reality. But yeah, debasement really seems to be what it's about in the culture at the minute. And maybe this is what, led you to say in our last interview, when I was talking about not writing off all of culture, and you said, again, paraphrasing yourself, well, I'm pretty much at the point where I am, prepared to, or at least considering writing off culture as it exists at the moment.
Yeah, I'm going to renege on that, as I say, because I got pulled back in, and maybe it's a trap, or maybe it's just unfinished business. What was I thinking about there? There were two things really that you were talking about. Oh yeah, the first thing was about the entities want something. And one thing they clearly seem to want, I'd say, is access to bodies. And that might even be that they want bodies. And that might be a clue to their nature. Although this day, the eponymous day, who knows how wide the spectrum is. Like I don't try and indulge in a taxonomy of entities, because I'd have to refer to knowledge, and it wouldn't be my knowledge, if you know what I mean. It would be based on things I'd read and heard. And Steiner is very good on this, so I have referred to it somewhat, or I've commented on his stuff. But what was I saying? Yeah, a spectrum of beings, entities, yeah, including perhaps hungry ghosts or ancestral fragments or what have you, that want access to bodies because they once had a body and they're having a really hard time without a body for whatever different reasons. I mean, the most obvious thing about hungry ghosts is that, I think, although it relates to this, is that if somebody dies and they've got all of these unhealthy attachments to life, and they can't satisfy those attachments, those needs, once they don't have a body, then they latch on to maybe a descendant or some other living human anyway, and compel them to do those things that they want to do and would do if they still had a body. That's a basic summation. People keep dropping away. We're getting smaller and smaller here. To the hungry ghost thing. But anyway, I mean, it seems that there's something inherently dysfunctional in an entity that wants something it hasn't got. I mean, and there's a weird symmetry, because, and maybe this is again like it's one thing that looks like too, that human beings are aspiring to not have a body. And that's actually not that new. I mean, transhumanism is new, but people have aspired to go to heaven, for example, where you have to be dead to go to heaven and stuff. So there are different ways in which human beings have aspired to transcend the physical long before transhumanism, though. But it's weirdly complementary with the entities wanting bodies.
Well, if you consider some of the ideas, and I'll use the word occult philosophy again, but the perennial wisdom, then we come from non-material, and we proceed. We eventually become non-material once again, and that's kind of destiny, if you want to use that. It's we will move beyond having physical bodies. We will transcend space and time, even. So it could be that kind of drive within us that's kind of just misplaced in some current trends. Not realizing that that we're immortal in any case.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's that's certainly a big subject, isn't it? I mean, you said those things as sounded like they were statements of belief.
Well, no, it's just it's a perception of a possibility, as it were, a sense,
Yeah,
because belief is it's either you know something or you don't. But in that case, what can we actually know? So we know nothing, I would say. So it's all a matter of belief on one level. But no, it's just a sense of that. How can I put it? It's part of a tapestry of concepts or ideas that account for our experience in a way, if you see what I mean, that kind of help to make sense of what we experience, really. And then say, okay, well, if X, then if X was such, then Y would make sense. That's
so
all. It's quite scientific in a way. It's looking at what you're seeing, what you're observing, and then coming up with a hypothesis as to what might explain that.
maybe. I was going to ask, but maybe I'll just make it a statement rather instead, that for me, the idea that we might exist eternally in a non-physical capacity, that can only be confirmed while we are alive. And so it's, in a way, it's kind of the opposite of what you said, but maybe it's complementary, that it can't be an aspect of belief, or whatever the expression is, an article of belief, maybe faith, because that's closer to something maybe that acknowledges it doesn't know, but hands over the question to a higher power. But what I wanted to say is that for me, insofar as it's possible to have a felt sense of something in me that is eternal and that isn't contingent on the physical, even though I am experiencing it in a physical body, so I'm somehow experiencing it through the physical, and with the awareness that I could be wrong and I could be delusional. That's the thing that, as you put it, transcends the physical. So to me, it's not that we transcend the physical after we die, but that we transcend the physical here and now, and I go even further, things we are talking about, this big subject, only insofar as we are able to transcend the physical here and now in this body, do we do so after we die. I'd say it's entirely contingent on bringing that experience into the temporal, to then we create this bridge, really. We create a bridge for us to cross over afterwards, and that is consistent with certain ideas like Keats' The Veil of Soul Making, that a human soul only comes into being through a life of alignment to God's will. I just keep it simple. A life that orientates itself towards goodness, and so becomes compatible with, or an instrument of the eternal, really absorbed into the eternal, and then well, God takes that soul into its fold. But otherwise, I think that I don't think that I think that that's all just an idea and a belief, and that actually probably, although we are in a time in history where there's this anti-human, atheistic dominant belief, it doesn't. I mean, there were plenty of anti-human and malevolent and demonic programs and behaviors when it was a predominantly Christian culture. We don't want to deceive ourselves about that. Like, Christianity was an instrument for demonic forces also. So people could believe in the soul and the afterlife, and they still act like monstrous human beings, and so they ain't going anywhere when they die either. I mean, they're just going to stay stuck in hell, or whatever the alternative is. I can't remember what my point was there. Oh yeah, the belief in the soul, the belief in immortality, and these things. It seems to me that they're like many of the worst human beings have subscribed to those, so they seem to be very much tainted, damaged goods. And so the indication to me that as I explored in Prism Infinity, is that those beliefs themselves can be deranging and dissociative, and so we need to find an alternative to this experience, understanding of what you're saying transcends the physical. And to bring it back to our today's subject, I think it has to do with entities, because many entities, they do transcend the physical, and they may well be able to whisper in our ear that we're going to go to heaven, or we'll be as gods, and so on. And they may even be able to create these bardo realms or what have you, where we think, etc., etc. So there's all kinds of tricks and traps if we don't develop discernment of spirits. I mean, this is the classic bardo realm thing, isn't it? With Buddha, he gets all these temptations from the spirits. If he isn't absolutely rooted in his center of knowing, if we're not absolutely rooted in our connection to reality, then we're going to get tricked and trapped by these entities. And how do we get rooted? Well, again, it has to be while we're in this life, and we're actually constantly being beset by these entities, and we don't even know it. So we keep going along with them, and so we gradually run out of time, right? because in this context, our life is a period of time in which we get to say no to all the entities, like Jesus in the desert, in time for dying. Like if we manage to say no to all of them, then good. We're pretty much in the clear when we die. It might still be rocky, but basically we know, I know you, I know you, I know you, right? All the ones that come to trick us, we've already identified them.
Well, yeah. Then otherwise, you're back again. You know, yeah. I'm have the, again sense. I'm absolutely convinced in as much as I can be in any kind of like non-material evidence sort of way that I've done this before. Whatever this is, this isn't new. I don't feel like this is the first time I've had this strange dreamlike experience.
I
So
know
I
I have that feeling too, but I also have, sorry to interrupt, but I also have the feeling that time is an illusion, and I'm going to say why. That it must be an illusion, because I also have the feeling that this is probably my last shot, that we've run out of time. So for that, no more incarnations, and if they do incarnate, they're going to incarnate into the Borg. So it's worse than non-existent. So what are the odds that we'd happen to be born right at the end? It seems too improbable. So then I think, it must be, we must have somehow created a fictional interpretation that includes reincarnation as a way to, at least, it's like second matrix, at least extend beyond, because we know it's not what it seems, and then reincarnation, well, okay, but it's still fictional, because, as I say, like, it's still time bound, right? How many lives do you get, and what happens when you run out of lives, right? It's still linear. So somehow it doesn't, even though I agree with you, I feel also I've been here before, I've done it before, but I can't believe in reincarnation, because when I actually start thinking it through, I meet these contradictions. I just throw up my hands and go, I don't know. All I know is I'm here now, so I better just act as if this is my one shot.
Oh yeah, I think that's the approach to it, isn't it? It's like live every day like it's your last. Yeah, that's absolutely the right approach. It's like if not now, then when?
Exactly, because it
Well,
won't get easier. If we even
yeah,
if we get a second chance, if we blow it this time, it's going to be harder the next time.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, and that's what it's meant to be. To use a word like an ascension, it's not meant to be treading water, not meant to be going in circles. But of course, that's it's what a lot of incarnated beings are doing. That's but that's not it is meant to be a progression. I say you moving through different states, as it were. It's the best way I can put it, I think.
Yeah, well, it's evolutionary, isn't it? I mean, that's another problem I had with it, because it seemed consistent with this idea of evolution, except it's spiritual evolution. I don't know, Steiner was into it, so maybe, but because the Christian thing is more, it's still linear, but it's leading to the end point, and you've basically just got to get right with God before Jesus comes back with the fiery sword.
Yeah, that's just a matter of time space or space time perception, isn't it? The idea those things are not fundamental. I've said this until I'm blue in the face. That they're not space and time are not a scaffolding upon which reality is somehow suspended. They're within a wider reality. So whatever we say about those notions, they're within a larger sort of context. And that's another problem we have is imagining eternity. The
Yeah.
idea that there has always been something, put something in air quotes, and that if we could travel out into the wider solar system and then beyond the galaxy, which I don't think is the point. That cannot be done. That's just an idea that we've become obsessed with. It must be achievable. If we could do that, there would be no limit. That's just there's artifacts. These ideas that there are limits, whatever it is, time and space. They're just artifacts of human consciousness, of our minds, and the hardcore materialism of the last few centuries has just crystallized that really again. But it's something I think that's where we find ourselves now, moving away from, but not liking it. You see what I mean? We're being pushed at the minute rather than moving with any sort of volition. We're kind of we're getting hard lessons day by day in schooled in what reality, if not what it really is, what it might be. And this is why so many people are talking about oh well, these ideas are not new, because they're not. So yeah, end of statement.
What do you think we're being pushed away from?
Pushed away from?
Yeah, you said now we're being pushed away, whether we like it.
Well, just again the dominant paradigm, materialist paradigm of the last few centuries, since the scientific and industrial revolution, that matter is all that matters, and that's all there is.
Well, let's linger on that for a second, because this thing about being dominant, because I think there's a clue in here as well, like the idea of the 1%, for example, because it hasn't really been dominant in terms of numbers until quite recently, wouldn't you say? I mean, until even 50 years ago.
You're absolutely right, and it's coming top down. Yeah, the 1%, whatever phrase you want to use, it's been imposed. It's a framework, an ideological framework that's been imposed.
Yeah, and so we've been conditioned, we've been socially engineered and trauma generated, conditioned by adverse circumstances, etc., to adopt it, haven't we? To adopt it and somehow put our faith in it, which brings us right up to date with mRNA and whatnot. There's this crazy blind faith. I watched a documentary recently about Heaven's Gate, that cult, which I'm sure you know plenty about. They were quite notorious at the time. And I was quite surprised by, I don't know how sympathetic or how kind of normal the people were. And not by the end, obviously. By the time they'd castrated themselves and then committed mass suicide, assuming it wasn't like Jonestown and they weren't murdered. And of course, the documentary left out any kind of military involvement or intelligence involvement in that, because it looks like a psyop. It's so weird. But the main point, the reason I brought it up was that it was surprising that the people who fell into that cult, they weren't all whack jobs. By the end they were, but at the beginning, the way that they showed it, I could have even seen myself being curious and thinking, well, that's interesting. I can see some merit in it. I was into aliens for a time. But that looks like the most extreme cult to us now. And yet collectively, and then part of that cult was that the two claimed that they were the two witnesses in the book of Revelation who happened to be extraterrestrials, and that they'd come from the kingdom of heaven, which was a physical place, and that they were going to gather the chosen ones and put them in a mothership, which is a physical ship, and take them to the kingdom of heaven. They completely literalized the religious ideas, and to the point where people were physically castrated because they wouldn't need their their balls in the kingdom of heaven, and in the meantime they were just distracting, right? So that means it's a really stark example of what happens when a religion possesses people. It's not a religion really, but a fake religion possesses people and becomes so literal and so materialistic, and we're seeing it at a collective level now with billions of people who've taken something into their body, have submitted to an experiment, basically out of blind faith in this thing called science/big pharma. Like, how did that happen? Not only did the scientific method get co-opted by scientific institutions and become science, which doesn't even have to use the scientific method anymore, right? To identify itself as science, but then that got spliced together or made synonymous with big pharma, which is a corporate industry of, medical experimentation and drugs and stuff. So when we talk about mission creep, so far from what science was supposed to be, and yet in the process raising up science to the level of religion. I can't remember where I was going with this, so hopefully you can...
Well, we got millions of people now who don't think they need their balls.
Well, that's literally true in the case of trans people.
Well, it's exactly the same thing. We lived through the cult of COVID, and here we are now with the cult of the trans cult. And I again reinforce what I said earlier about sexual identity and freedom and people being what they want to be. But
well, why do you make that qualifier? Because
just because of pushback that you get. I did it. I don't know if you have given up doing this. I'd like to. Qualifying these things by sort of saying, blah 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 blah.
No, I never qualify it. I never qualify it, because if somebody is actually being coerced into cutting their balls off, to me that they're a victim of something really diabolical. So I don't want to sugarcoat or pussyfoot around that.
No, I guess it's in our culture that things are conflated, aren't they? It's and I probably shouldn't play that game. You're right. You sort of put these in little caveats in because you're trying to explain. You say in what I'm saying, I'm not saying the following.
Yeah.
In passing, making a statement about a certain situation, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be able to do X, whatever it happens to be. That's all, because it's used because we live in such a black and white culture. You're either with us or you're against us. It can be if you're exploring, as we do, in things, nuance, color, variation, how things can change, how things can be seen differently from different angles. That's not really a popular platform, is it? You've either got to just like you're either one thing or the other. It was summed up in the wake of 9/11, memorably by George Bush, the poor idiot boy Jr. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
Yeah, and it's a slippery slope actually, because the fanatics who can't tolerate nuance, they well, I don't want to even say they, because there are qualifications I make. Maybe if I say they, I'm talking about the entities. But this isn't really about human individuals, so I will make that qualifier. But the apparatus of the ideology is designed to be a slippery slope. So if you go along with it a little bit, the next thing you know, you're having your own balls cut off, right? You start with figuratively castrating yourself, and you end up literally doing so. So without actually becoming compensatory, reactive pushback, because I certainly try and avoid that. I've become more firm and more fearless, if you like, or more bold in my expressions of my position around this. Because I think it's more effective as well, actually, because you find that the thought police, they back away from people who don't show any guilt or hesitation, because they know it's hopeless. Whereas if you start to qualify and apologize, they're all over you.
Yeah, well, I guess it's true. It's showing a sign of weakness, isn't it? In the wild, lions selecting which gazelle they're going to go after, as it were. And,
yeah, I mean, there's just, of course, I understand, and I make qualifiers around trans, that in terms of somebody who is struggling with this body dysphoria, I have plenty of compassion for that person, but that's very much that's inseparable from my determination to expose the evil that they're becoming complicit with if they go along with the fantasy of a gendered identity and then try and do or comply with terrible things being done to their body. They are victims. They're absolutely victims of the thing that you and I might be trying to expose. They may not want to hear that. And obviously the activists want to cut our heads off, never mind our balls for saying it. But that's too bad, isn't it? I mean, you can't help somebody if you're not willing to tell them the truth.
Oh yeah, and you've just expressed more eloquently than I did. What I was trying to say earlier. Really, I think, but all of what's going on around that agenda, for example, and a lot of which went into overdrive during the pandemic period, that does serve this agenda to disconnect us from our reality, whether it's from our own bodies or whether it's from from nature itself. Think how we were prevented from going into nature, during that time. People being sort of moved along or arrested or whatever, for sitting on a park bench. This gaslighting, this the cognitive dissonance that all of the blatantly contradictory ideas and information coming out of the culture and what that generates is certainly doesn't serve us at all, but it does serve an end, because on one level it literally doesn't make any sense. But if you step back and have a look at it, what effects is it producing, then you can start to see a pattern. I think literally up is down, left is right, black is white, wrong is right. And that either that's achieving something in itself for whatever agenda, whatever entities, or it's laying the ground for something, or maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
And the culture in itself, not when I say culture, I mean now specifically that that you and I engage with a lot, or certainly thought a lot about and spoken a lot about cultural artifacts, movies, music, TV, social media, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does make it easier to uncouple oneself from the toxic anti-life forces, which work very long and hard to create bait for us, to keep us subscribing to their agendas and their ideologies. It does make it easier to unsubscribe and uncouple the more toxic it gets. If with culture, I've been trying to stop myself watching TV shows and movies over the last few years. Trying is quite the right word, but I'm becoming more aware that I would like to, let's say, and I have been reducing my intake a lot harder. I mean, I'm watching Succession now, but that's pretty much it for TV shows. But it's become easier because so many that I have tried to watch within half an hour of the first episode, I'm having to watch a couple of lesbians being lesbians for no good reason and got nothing to do with the plot, just because the BBC won't fund any TV show if it doesn't have lesbians in it, or whatever else it is. All of it's the equivalent of diversity hires, but it's tokenism. It's been around for a long time, actually. But yeah, I mean, that's just a very stark example. I would say that the trans thing, and maybe we can bring this back to a general thing of entities, but staying for a moment on the specifics, the trans thing, which, as you pointed out earlier, it extends well beyond transgender. I just heard about trans generic, I think it's called, or something. Anyway, it means you want to be a different species. That's now doing the rounds, and it's not that new, but it's becoming more widespread now. You want to be surgically altered to be a fish or a reptile, and so on. That it jumped the shark some time ago, and it's become more and more obviously toxic. And I will bring this back to entities, but I'll just finish this point. That's making it easier and easier for people like you or I to talk about it without getting jumped all over, I think. But more importantly, it's getting easier for parents and for children to avoid these terrible entity-based traps. Not that there aren't new ones being built, because you know me, I'm always skeptical or cynical about these things. But yeah, it gets more and more manifestly demonic, I would say, to call a spade a spade. So in a certain sense, that makes it easier. But I think it's also evidence that the demons, the entities, are becoming more and more confident that they have enough human bodies in their program, in their army, that it doesn't really matter now if they start pride parading. You know, satanic pride parade is it's not a figure of speech, actually, because the Church of Satan has come out now and kind of they're celebrating Satanism in various places, and it's very compatible with woke culture. Apparently, it seems from what I saw of the Satanic Temple that they were mostly kind of woke type characters, and the LGBTQ, etc. So it's becoming openly satanic, while of course rebranding Satanism as just one more choice and expression of the freedom of the human spirit to reinvent itself. But my point being, finally, that, and Steiner talked about this, that as the Aramanic invasion unfolds, he didn't call it that, the difference between good and evil will become more and more apparent as human beings who've given themselves over or been taken over by dark forces. It begins to show physically. They actually become physically altered, so that the entities. I mean, you imagine an entity takes the body, and then it wants to what's the word they talk about now for body modulation? What do they call it? Body modulation or whatever. But anyway, the entity wants to reformat the body so it's more comfortable, more fits the entity's own appearance of itself. And there is a growing awareness of entities, I think. And then Naomi Wolf wrote something about it recently. So it's getting more mainstream while Christianity is having this revival. So it seems to me that we're on a curve of awareness here, where we can talk about these things, where it's becoming more and more not just acceptable but necessary to allow for a very radical alternate interpretation for something like gender dysphoria, which is possession, and one of the oldest diagnoses that there is.
Yeah, well, I mentioned Dracula and Renfield before. You look how different Renfield looked, when we see him possessed and when he did prior to that. And Jekyll and Hyde thing, isn't it, as well? You see how the appearance physically changes. And I've mentioned science fiction. That's a popular trope in it as well. Somebody physically beginning to change to reflect something internal. At a very simplistic level, you see people who are beset by some kind of mental illness, how that affects their body. The mind suffers, the body cries out. It cannot not but change your physical appearance if all is not well in your mind. That makes sense. How is someone going to flourish physically if they're sick in the head? It just completely makes sense. You don't water a plant, it wilts. I was thinking in terms of you were talking about the entities feeling confident. There are some people who hold that there's actually what we're seeing now is desperation. So, there's two different ways you can come at that.
Yeah.
I wonder, in terms of debasement and outrage, I sometimes wonder, as you talk about the frog, slowly being cooked in the pot as you turn up the temperature very gradually, and it ends up boiling to death. What, in terms of outrage, what it would take to get a meaningful reaction, meaningful pushback, for example, at some point, are we going to see predators in the street able to take a child from its parents and sexually assault them in the street in front of their parents? That sounds like unimaginable. If we get to that point, is somebody going to say, hang on, no? Is somebody going to step in and say, this is not, this is not a new societal norm that we're that we were going to allow. Yeah, recently I was listening to your talk with Posey Parker. I can't forget the lady's name, but I listened to that with great interest, and she made a similar point about what, you know, it's kind of an inflection point in this trans agenda. And I think the phrase she simply used is like, you know, something, the straw that breaks the camel's back might be where, you know, when something really bad happens. But what is that something really bad? What does that look like?
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, people are speaking up anyway, and it's not. I mean, doesn't necessarily. It makes a difference to individuals, but in terms of the tide of the trend, or the trend of the tide, it doesn't. Did you hear about this UN, the legitimization of pedophilia? Have you heard about this recent development?
Just as a passing headline, I've not looked into the details. I don't know what you know, the matter of it really is. You know, the content,
Yeah.
I should say.
Well, since it's topical, we might as well bring in something that's really hot off the press. I have it in front of me. It's a UN document of some sort, and Principle 16 is consensual sexual conduct, and it says, with respect to the enforcement of criminal law, any prescribed minimum age of consent to sex must be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Enforcement may not be linked to the sex, gender of participants, or age of consent to marriage. Moreover, sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent to sex may be consensual, in fact, if not in law. So it's introduced, it's not, as far as I can see, based on that, it's not yet changing the law, but it's the lead into changing the law, because it's not acknowledging, it's presenting, or it's pushing the idea that children can consent to sex with adults.
Well, I mean, the age of consent, as we know, has varied. It varies across cultures and societies, and it varies across time, and it varies even now in different parts of the world. So, in some sense, it's arbitrary. However, it stems from some kind of understanding, knowing you know, it's there for a reason, shall we say? It isn't actually completely arbitrary. It's an attempt to delineate something, you know, meaningful, and that's why this matters. You know, though those who perhaps would subscribe to the trends that you've been talking about, why they would, you know, deny that, but it is important.
Well, sure. I mean, we're preaching to the choir on that front, and that I'm probably good to. I mean, I just wanted to present that as an example without necessarily getting pulled into that, because it's a whole other conversation, isn't it? But in terms of what is, what can fly, what can get by, that would lead to the kind of scenario that you're talking about. I mean, you use that as an example, like an adult sexually grabbing a child sexually on the street and nobody doing anything because they've been propagandized enough that they would feel that they were pedophobic if they were to do something about it. It does seem as though that's got to be a ways away, because currently the climate seems to be, more people are pedophobic, more people are very hostile to pedophilia, even to the point that they exaggerate it. And if, you know, Roman Polanski's, well, he probably is a pedophile actually, and so is Woody Allen. So I can't really name names, but somebody who has sex with a 14-year-old is called a pedophile, which is just technically inaccurate, and it's a really dangerous blurring of lines, because there's just no correlation between having sex with somebody who's pubescent and the prepubescent. But anyway, my point was there that there's a lot of moral outrage around pedophilia that's misguided. Even this, you could even say there's too much outrage, seeing as it's not directed, it's not organized, it's not conscious, and so on. So there's probably some sort of schismogenetic program going on here, which is, because you could say with homosexuality, like homosexuality was around for a long time and it was kind of tolerated. It was just, certainly in the higher classes, I'm not sure, but anyway, but there was a period leading up to it becoming legalized and normalized, in which there was a growing awareness of the intolerance of homosexuality. And that may have been engineered even to some degree. Like, not only do you increase the awareness of intolerance of homosexuality, well, you can increase the awareness of the intolerance by increasing the awareness of the thing that people are intolerant to. People can be managed at a mass scale in that way. But basically the end result is you create this thing called homophobia, and then you provide the solution, which is normalization of homosexuality. And then what gets lost in the shuffle is, what is homosexuality? What is its relation to sexual trauma, to emotional incest with the mother, to etc., etc., to dysfunctionality, rather than it just being this totally normal, healthy thing that should be celebrated. That you can actually get thrown in jail as a therapist if you try to help somebody to not be homosexual, even if they want to, right? So that was a pretty rapid curve. So it could happen with pedophilia, absolutely. And that is, the woke culture is, I think, trying to celebrate pedophilia as we speak. Anyway, it's interesting because you brought that up as for you, that was the tipping point to the acknowledgement of entities, the thing of the malevolence towards children.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and that again, I mentioned that in the COVID context, but it's very much we see that now, in the trans agenda. Absolutely, that pushback that you describe, the sort of that you said was, because it was unfocused and maybe not completely not conscious, shall we say, that maybe there was too much of it. But that pushback, I think, is an instinctual thing. Maybe that's why it isn't focused or fully conscious. But the discombobulation, the cognitive dissonance, the gaslighting that I've referred to off and on throughout this is part of trying to cloud that. I think that, there are knowing of wrong and right, a basic understanding. It when I see things, I think, that's good. I don't even have to think why, or that's bad. I don't even have to think why. I just know that it is, and I'm confident in that. That instinctual drive, I think, is a lot of what moves us forward. It's evolutionary. It keeps us alive. Often as not. And I think there's definitely a war against that. Trying to tell us that we can't trust any of that, and that these opposite, wrong is in fact right. Black is in fact white, up is down, and you cannot trust your never mind your five senses. You can't trust that you're kind of your inner knowing, your gut. Those things that, as I say, can make the difference between life and death, or any other kind of situation like that.
Yeah, it can encapsulate that with the tolerance, the ideology of tolerance, which basically has zero tolerance for intolerance. I mean, never mind the paradox of that, but it's like also like the woke thing is that you cannot judge. And if you do judge, you will be judged. Like the one thing you'd be judged for is if you judge others. That's a different way of putting the thing. That the only thing that can't be tolerated is intolerance. That's this what you're talking about there. That's the all permissive age. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. That's postmodern now. It's woke culture, and that's a smorgasbord for entity feeding. That's absolutely what it is. I mean, that's how I see it anyway. You can
anything goes. Anything goes as long as it's it's the latest thing. It's the current thing. Anything goes apart from that which does not go.
Yeah, well, but it specifically has to do with indulgence of personal desires and personal whims. So the things that don't go are more to do with community awareness, moral restrictions, boundaries, right? Things that have to do with how communities, what they need to function well together. Not only, but I'm going to focus on that to make the distinction that what's trendy, what's a la mode, and that goes is included in the anything goes thing, is about the indulging of whims, and that I'd say that has to do with the entity. I mean, that's how the entities feed, and that has to do with fragmentation human communities.
Yeah, I mean, you bring children up again. Can't speak as a parent, but you bring children up. I mean, I was a child once, and I was brought up within with guidelines and boundaries, and some of which I might have agreed with, at the time, or or not agreed with, or didn't understand. And then in retrospect, some of which I could disagree with, or agree with, or understand, or otherwise. And then as individuals, as adult individuals, we'd like to think the idea is that we set our own boundaries, we police ourselves, whatever it happens to be. That actually sounds like a negative, because there's a hell of a lot of self-policing going on at the minute. And that applies to, as you say, societally as well. Society can't function without rules and boundaries and whatnot. You see this. This is one of the things that people label indigenous societies, those that are still extant, as kind of somehow being limited, because they have these clear delineations of how things are, how things should be, how they will be, and for example, in anything that might have been anyone that might have been identified as a threat to society, maybe in millennia gone by, that individual might have been taken out into the woods and just quietly bled, because it threatened to undermine the entire, the entire society, the village, the people, whatever.
I just watched a documentary about a town psycho that was killed by the whole town. Should we look at the question?
Yes, because I'm also conscious that we have we're now, and we've done over 90 minutes, so we can we can look at the final phase, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's a very long question here. Do you want to read it, or shall I?
I'm not able to do that with the tech as I'm set up here, so if you're able to, that would be good.
Okay, this is from Thomas, or maybe Thomas wants to read it. Just if you want to ask it, Thomas, then just unmute or something and take over. Otherwise, I'll read it for you. What role does narcissism play in entity influence? The question is focused on those at the extreme end of the narcissistic spectrum rather than a normal person with some narcissistic traits. Narcissists can be quite negative towards themselves, lack of self-love, for example. Oh, well, then that's okay. So there's more than one thing. They asked about Sage. So that's about clearing negative entities. And then as a talking point, it's interesting to think of a motel or hotel room that has an entity laying around from the previous person who slept there. You go about your day not realizing that you picked up an entity attachment from a seemingly benign hotel room. What subtle signs can we pick up on in our day-to-day life of an entity having influence over yourself or someone in your company? This may be a broad and naive question, however, and may need further unpacking. Yeah, well, that last one is I mean, it's good. It's bringing it back to practical basics. Yeah. Do you have any comment on that, Greg? Do you have any experience?
Well, in terms of energy, that I think that something we haven't really got into, but I think that the material reality that we experience with our five senses is more like a continuum. There aren't any individual objects, actually, and I would sort of apply that to entities or individuals as well. I think there is a continuum there, so it's not surprising that energy would can move around in ways that we can't perceive. And this is characterized, I mentioned a few moments ago about intuition and gut feeling. This is why we have things that we call I've got a bad feeling about this, and famously this is can be recorded in in buildings. For example, buildings absolutely can take on character. Events can resonate through time. Events can imprint themselves upon what we perceive as matter. Let's put it that way, because it is a continuum, and the delineations that we perceive are not really below the surface or behind the scenes, to use that phrase again. Those boundaries go away. So yeah, hotel room, absolutely. I mean, I think that I've not had that experience per se myself, from a building, or particularly a place that I can think of, but I've certainly had it around a person. An example which is relevant to our talk here would be Prince Andrew. If any viewers don't know who that is, I'm talking about a member of the British royal family. At one point, had to for work. I was standing very close to him, like less than 6 feet away, for a few minutes, and it was palpable. The negative energy was palpable, such that I really, really wanted to withdraw from that space, but I wasn't able to. So yeah, I mean that's my initial thought on and certainly on energy and
is that I mean, obviously it's a unique experience. I presume it's unique to be standing by a member of the royal family and to have something so palpable. But is that unique or unusual for you to have a felt sense of somebody's negativity without actually having an interaction? I mean,
yeah, no, there was no interaction, I should add. If not unique, then certainly very rare. I consider myself to be a good judge of people, and not very often, but occasionally I will encounter someone who I just think, right, well, I'm obviously not going to have anything to do with them. I have to put my finger on it. It's just a feeling. But that way I've just described, that may be the only time. Actually, I can't think of any other time I have a similar experience.
didn't you have a weird anecdote about David Icke?
Well, I've got history there, but I wouldn't call it a weird as such. People can find, if people want the story behind this, I would, rather than go into it all now, I'd simply say if they go to legalizefreedom.com or Legalize Freedom YouTube channel. I think, did I entitle the video David Icke, Is He Right? If you look up that, you'll find out what Jason's referring to. But I wouldn't put it in the same category by any means.
No, yeah, I think I was conflating a couple of stories. One of them might have been from Icke himself. We're getting a bit, this is a sidetrack, but just a quick, curious question. Have you tried to get Icke onto Legalize Freedom?
I have not. No, I definitely had an in, having sort of encountered the guy a few times, and I use the phrase "worked with," but again, you'll find that out in the video. No, but I just haven't. No, it would be an easy one, I think, wouldn't it, in terms of like viewers, because whatever you say about the guy, even today, it's like Alex Jones as well. Whatever you say about some of these individuals, they've got a high profile. So if you engage with them, lots of people will want to check that out.
But I don't know if it'd be easy though, because unless I don't know how you are as a host, I have a feeling that you're not like me in this regard, because I don't want to have anyone on. I don't have a podcast anymore, but if I did, and when I did, I didn't want to have anyone on that I wouldn't confront if I felt that they were peddling bullshit. Generally, I just didn't have bullshit peddlers if I could help it. But if I was to talk to David Icke, I'd be quite tense about it, because I'd think, well, I'm going to have to take this bull by the horns, and it's a pretty big bull, right? So,
well, when I said easy, I meant in terms of like, you virtually wouldn't have to promote the thing. That's all I meant. Easy in terms of getting a lot of clicks.
Yeah, no, I know what you meant. Yeah. But would you feel like you wanted to challenge Icke if you spoke to him?
Well, yes, and I mean, in a sort of, I don't go looking for arguments or looking for a fight or whatever, but it seems to me, all I would say on that score, I think this is what you're getting at, is that he's someone who's kind of been on his journey of exploration, discovery, be it spiritual or otherwise, in a very public way. So he's gone from, he calls himself a dot connector. He's gone from one breadcrumb on the trail to another in full view, sometimes very public view. And he's made mistakes, and he's got things wrong, and he's got things right, with everybody looking on, really. So I'd like to think he would acknowledge that, and I think he does.
No, I'd be much more critical than that.
Yeah, well, again, that's fine. We're not each other.
I mean, I really don't trust Icke as well. I mean, as I said, this is a big digression, but yeah, I think Icke is entity driven. I think Icke is an entity, a vehicle for entities. I feel
that is possible, yeah. But you're now looking at where are we here? So I'd have to go back. Probably, I mean, I don't like to acknowledge this, but it must be 15 or more years since the period in time that I'm talking about. And I don't follow his work anymore. Not for no particular reason. I'm just on to, on to other things, as it were. So, so yeah, it's kind of, this is a bit like talking about somebody who no longer exists in a way, somebody who's passed away, maybe.
Well, yeah, I don't follow him either, and that's partly why. It's because I find that he was always saying the same thing, and that it always had that same feeling of he's sincere, but he's not actually. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's a salesman. But anyway, so that was a digression. Bringing it back, but it is relevant, because how I would answer Thomas's question about the practicality of identifying entities has to do with this, to me, as a very human level. Like I don't claim to, and I'm not sure I especially aspire to feeling energies. I hesitated there, because certainly I know that the spiritual senses need to be as open as they can be. I'm just not entirely convinced that is the equivalent of what we might think of as psychic powers, where you can start to see shadows or feel negative energy. I mean, your anecdote's much closer to just something that we just have a natural sense about. Not that any spiritual sense wouldn't be natural, about if somebody's carrying around a lot of negative baggage, you would of course expect to pick it up. But that must have been a lot, unless you're very sensitive, if you didn't even interact with them. Because what I wanted to say is that my gaze for entities is really a gaze that I think I've spent my whole life trying to develop, which is could partly be summed up with, is this person bullshitting me or not? But it's not as simple as, are they lying? It's like, are they pretending? Are they hiding? Are they trying to get something that they're not being honest about? Are they maybe variations of those things, really, covering up? Are they uncomfortable and not allowing themselves to express their, just how real are they? Like, for me, that's always been, like, since a child, I think that's been a imperative, like a prime directive, to try and find a way to have a real connection with whoever I'm encountering, and if not, get out of there. So I'd say that has to do with entities and an entity awareness. And well, okay, the third way between having the connection and getting out there is addressing it. Like, this person that I'm talking to, and this has to do with observing myself as well, how I'm responding, something is interfering with them. Right? So they're bullshitting, or they're hiding, or they're being creepy, or whatever it is. And how can I hack through that noise to get the signal? How can I confront them in such a way? Working in a thrift store, I was constantly getting slimed by customers who would just come in and talk at me. And I'd say that has to do with entities, that, like, their entities are trying to feed and multiply, spread around by capturing people, by talking and by, complaining or invoking pity, or what we talk about, psychic vampires. So I really had to try and develop an ability to stop people's entities I didn't think about it like that back then, from sliming me, from using that person to slime me without offending them, because, well, they're coming into my thrift store. I can't just offend people when I don't like them. It's not practical. Anyway, nobody, I don't like offending people, because it can make the situation worse. So anyway, that's my long-winded answer.
Yeah, there's a question of, like, maybe what you were attempting to find out in some of those examples is there anyone in there,
Yeah.
behind all that? And I
Yeah.
think in most of those cases there is. Whether it's too deeply buried or too far gone is another matter. And then there are a much smaller number, I think, that there isn't anything in there, but whether they constitute a different category of being or entity is brings us back, I think, really to where we more or less started. And me reminiscing about our talk. What if some people out there in the world are not like us? There seems to me that there's many more bodies on the earth than there are souls. Again, it's invasion of the body snatchers, where they live kind of idea.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were people in the thrift store that it was the equivalent of there being nobody home, and there was no point in trying to connect to them, except insofar as I had to discipline them to get them out of the shop, or make sure that they didn't just cause too much disruption while they were in the shop. So it was very much like dealing with children in a negative sense. Obviously, dealing with children can be actually much more meaningful than dealing with adults, but I mean in the sense of a child who's a tantrum or is sulking, or basically is just causing trouble, and you've got to find the best way to neutralize the problem.
Yeah, and you can't just give them a lolly every time, because their teeth will rot, if I can use that as a metaphor.
And they keep coming back for more lollies.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like we'll have similar experiences at different time frames, maybe. But I mean, even today, I mean, every day, pretty much, today being an exception, I deal with hundreds of people that I've never met before, and it's a real lesson in many things that we'll be talking about, and that's why I'm more convinced than ever that there's something else going on in terms of categories of being, and that we use the term human maybe a little bit too broadly, and even if this is only a metaphor, that there are different species and subspecies of humans.
So I presume you don't mean face to face hundreds of people.
Yeah, basically, I work in heritage tourism, so yeah, often hundreds of people face to face that I've never met before.
Wow.
Yeah, albeit usually very briefly.
Even so.
Yeah, it's intense.
You don't have to shake their hands, do you?
Sometimes they offer to, but I don't have an issue with that. I was shaking hands and you name it, right throughout the pandemic.
Well, I wasn't referring to
No, but I just mentioned that because that was another recent thing where it was like, clipping humanity's wings is like, never mind, don't be in the same space as each other. God forbid that you touch each other.
Yeah, it's curious though, because touch probably is a way that entities get around, never mind viruses, which I doubt the existence of more than I doubt the existence of entities, probably. Because I've got more direct experience of entities than viruses. But in that regard, making me think of this point you made about, are they desperate or are they confident, the entities? Maybe it's not one thing or the other, because the pandemic, as it's called in some quarters, you can see how it serves the interests of certain ways of entities and or vampiric overlords, and in other ways maybe doesn't, at least in the specifics of it. And that being an example, because for me, not having to shake hands was a blessing. That was always a problem, not wanting to shake people's hands, and finally I was free of it, because I don't like physical contact unless I really want physical contact with that person, like specifically. To me, it's a volitional thing, not a socially conditioned thing. Anyway. Yeah.
So, do we have any other, just thinking about winding up, do we have any other points, questions, anything that's come through that we can address?
Well, we could ask people who's there. Does anyone want to turn their camera on and meet us? Because this is an opportunity to meet at least two people. There were three, but I think one of them that I haven't met before. So I say don't be shy. It won't. Well, because I mean I'd have to edit it actually. But anyway, it's up to you. Somebody just I think Thomas did another one. But it's very long though. He's writing a book here. I think I'll make Mark if Mark wants us to answer that, you're going to have to unmute and say it, because otherwise, something about vampires. But yeah, you can. Anyone can unmute if they want to ask something.
So all I would just something's just come through there, I think, has it?
Yeah, just a thanks for the chat.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, are we any further forward than we were 2 hours ago? I'm not sure, but one thing I've keep an eye on a great deal at the minute is that advances in science in terms of again, and without air quotes on this occasion, in terms of dark matter, dark energy, and everything I mentioned earlier about the reality such that it is beyond five senses and three dimensions, and how little we actually perceive, and therefore how much room there is for the unknown. The entity realm, it seems to me, is most of what they're actually, we can't say is, but appears to be. It's infinitely more vast than this this little sort of glass cage that we're occupying.
Well, certainly it leads into, I would say, you were talking about eternity earlier, and David Shannon was talking about hell recently at Easter, and so, in order for us to get to eternity in the spiritual realms, dimensions, we have to go through the gauntlet of hell, which is where the entities dwell. So yeah, I think that's like the physical realm, and then the psychic or the interpsychic realms, as Charles Upton calls it, which aren't eternal and they're not spiritual, but they're non-material, so they last a lot longer. And as you were saying, they're a lot bigger. But then there's the eternal. So that's my sense of it, and that's one of the trump cards of entities, that because our spiritual senses are closed, we can't tell the difference between psychic entities and or fallen demonic angels and stuff, and eternal principles, because they're both equally invisible and non-material to us. So it's relatively easy for a demon to trick a human whose spiritual senses are closed into thinking that they're having congress with an angel.
Yeah, exactly. And there's lots of entity-based sci-fi and horror, isn't there? When something's revealed to be you're interacting with something, it turns something apparently beautiful, it turns out to be hideous.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know somebody who's had that experience, actually, that very experience. I saw that Thomas turned his camera on, so I'm keen. He turned it off again, but maybe he thought the window had closed. But if you want to introduce yourself, Thomas, then I'd be very happy to meet you. And the same for Mark J, who I think I've been in touch with by email for a while, but I've never met. Maybe Thomas went away from the camera. Or maybe he was a demon disguised as an angel, and we just broke his glamour magic. Oh, look, he's disappeared entirely now. There he is.
Well, I mean, are we what we think we are, you and I, in that context?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we probably think that we're people, or we're probably in the habit of thinking of ourselves as people, without much basis for that. I mean, what is that? This idea of a person. What is a person?
Yeah, and if we're experiencing reality such that along the lines of what I mentioned, that there appear to be that we don't resonate with, or don't appear to be the same as or similar to most of these other meat bags that we meet on the street, then what does that say in itself? Is being in a minority necessarily a good thing?
Well, I suppose it depends on the majority, doesn't it? I mean, I'm glad we're not in the majority based on what I can see of the majority. But
yeah,
if we were in the majority, I mean, this is the thing about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, to bring it full circle, because that was what you started with talking about, that podcast I did, Sorcerer's Revelation, sorry, not Apprentice. That's funny, because that's just two words that have kind of been stuck together by our culture. So I just said them automatically. The part of that analysis was that many thought forms or soulless bodies had been created in order to prevent those of us who are souls incarnated here from finding each other. So there'd just be this sea of humans, and we wouldn't, with our spiritual senses, because we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between somebody who was real and a non-player character. And so we couldn't find and connect to our team. So we potentially would be lost.
I think that's what's behind the drive, beyond reproduction. You know, the physical idea of like male and female make children, the species goes on. I think that's what is behind the drive. To find someone. You know, we use the phrase, you know, my other half. You know, you feel like you're meeting yourself in a way. If you ever have a relationship like that, or relationships, that's certainly my experience anyway. And that's what, in some ways, keeps us moving forward. You know, it's like heat, warmth, shelter. You know, it's finding the other, finding yourself.
Finding yourself by finding the others, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great note to
That's what.
end on, personally, because I think that is very much why I do what I do, and it sounds like it's why you do what you do. So it's really good to put that front and center. That's why we're doing this. If you're out there, make contact. There's only like 5 of you came today. My God, I sent this out to 2,500 people, supposedly. Obviously not. I thought they were people, but
Yeah, well, that's it is what it is, isn't it? You know, again, we could start an analysis and spend another hour talking about the reasons behind that. You know, so but
yeah.
well, maybe another time, perhaps.